Thank you, Jana. So welcome to the second panel, whose title is Generative, Praxis, Medial, Entanglements, Artistic Expansion. I am happy to welcome for this panel Yasmil, Raymond, Christian Rattemeyer, and Gregory Williams. I will first present the three of you. So Yasmil, you were appointed Rector of the Hochschule für Bildende Künste, Städelschule, and Director of the Porticus in Frankfurt in April 2020. Previously, between 2015 and 19, you were Associate Curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And before that, curator at the Dia Art Foundation in New York, where you curated the exhibition Franz Erhard Walther, Work as Action, which took place between 2010 and 12. You are also member of the advisory board of the Franz Erhard Walther Foundation since 2016. Christian, you were the director of the SculptureCenter in New York until September 20. After having worked at the Museum of Modern Art in New York as the Harvey Shipley Miller Associate Curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints since 2007. You are the author of the essay Franz Erhard Walther, Objects to Use, Instrument for Processes, published in the context of the Walther exhibition at the Romex Museum in Mexico City in 2018. And you are also a member of the advisory board of the Franz Erhard Walther Foundation. And Gregory, you are Associate Professor of Contemporary and Modern Art at Boston University. You research art produced in the German-speaking countries since 1945. You published on international artists in relation to globalization, exhibition culture, humor, and politics. And you are the author of the essay, Time Must Be Articulated, Drawing and Memory in Franz Erhard Walther's work, published in the catalog of the Franz Erhard Walther exhibition at the Henry Art Gallery in Seattle in 2016. The aim of this second panel is to question the plasticity and instability of mediums at the heart of Franz Erhard Walther's work, their possibility of submitting to mutation, hybridizations and openings, to extensions and expansions according to the temporal and spatial parameters with which his proposal come up against and which institutional reality may at times impose on them. This instability is obviously contrary to the partitioning of practices and mediums called for by the modernists, and which resurfaces in many respects in certain minimalist practices of which Walther was a contemporary, even through obviously and in minimalist matter. The partitioning in question will above all claim to define works that want to be freed from traditional mediums. But Donald Judd's will, for example, to insist on the specificity of an object testifies in many ways to a need to delimit it, where Walther will always seek to renegotiate said limits for new ends. As such, it will be recalled that Walther, for his part, never rejected his identity as a sculptor, but a sculptor, of course, in the expensive sense of the term, a sculptor who certainly sculpts materials, think of his recent body shapes, but also time and space, not to mention language. In 1987, for example, Walther referred to language as a material specifying, I mean that in a way the sculptor uses wood and iron and the painter uses canvas and oil paint. Language is a material that I shape with. One could also mention that Peter Weibel spoke of a performative turn in sculpture to characterize the works of his companion Walther. The whole complexity of Walther's work therefore resides in the difficulty of circumscribing the mediums used by the artist, of stopping them in the sense that one could understand it in a frozen form. Because if Walther uses volumes in 3 dimensions and mediums in 2, the scope of a particular work can be contrary to appearances. Der Schein trügt, as the German expression says. In this regard, it suffices to consider two families of the artist's work: the Werkzeichnung, produced in the 60s and the first half of the 70s, in resonance with the pieces composing the first work set, and the Wandformation of the 80s. At first glance, the Werkzeichnung are drawings in the most traditional sense of the term, except that those drawings, which have ended up acquiring over time semi-autonomy, are the continuation in the most indexical sense of the term of the parts in volume and in fabrics of the work set. They constitute an extension of it which confuses their identity. And the link that connects them to their counterparts in volume does not allow us to fully emancipate their graphic and two-dimensional character. The same is true of the Wandformation, of the wall formations and other configurations produced by the artists from the 80s on. Of sculptural appearance, these works are not without intersecting a pictorial paradigm that the degree of visibility, they are also addressed to the eye, then to the viewer's body, only accentuates. Finally, the fact that some of these configurations originate from this or that formal composition sketched in a Werkzeichnung, themselves once again dependent on three-dimensional origins, says a lot about the instability of Walther's own medium and practices and the need to consider them in a broader perspective. In moving from object to image and image to object, Walther's work are often subject to changes of regimes and status, to identity changes and mutations, changes that are the relationship to the architectural environment, without even talking about the link uniting them to a viewer and or user, only reinforces. This panel will be an opportunity to come back to these questions, and I will ask Gregory to speak first.
Hey. Thanks, Erik. Thanks, everyone, and thanks especially to Jana and Andrea and Lily and everybody at the Hauts-de-France for setting this up. I've never been in a streaming festival, so this is exciting. I'm going to read mine just to keep things moving. And so I'm going to start by sharing my screen. In Dust of Stars, a series of drawings and handwritten texts produced between 2007 and 2009, Franz Erhard Walther reflected upon transitional moments in his career. One of the entries for 1957, the year he turned 18, indicates his initial excitement at having been admitted to the Werkkunstschule Offenbach, the School of Applied Arts near Frankfurt. Here, Walther hoped that he would find what he called solid footing for the art experiments that he had carried so far out on his own. He lists a number of skills he wanted to develop, including studying painting techniques, color theory, and art history. However, soon after starting the program, he reports that, quote, "The daily routine as a student proved to be different. Soon the school-like assignments bored me," end quote. And while he soon left the Werkkunstschule for study at more traditional art academies, Walther later benefited from learning precision hand lettering and the use of stencils to produce images with the practical appeal of commercial signage. This grounding in pragmatic decision-making and consistent technique had a significant impact on much of his subsequent output, even as he went on to embrace an experimental approach that unhinged traditional conceptions of medium, material, and spectatorship. Walther's vocational exercises at Offenbach led to his Wortbilder, or word pictures of the late 1950s, a body of work to which the 1958 tempo belongs. He has spoken of these images as prompting the viewer to envision a relationship between the shape of the word, its location on the sheet, and the chosen colors. In this reference to the museum, the word seems to rest at the bottom of the sheet of paper, giving it a sense of downward gravitational pull that suggests the built environment, as does the color of the ground, which resembles concrete. With these images' bold sans serif fonts, one is reminded of the modernist Bauhaus-derived typefaces with their assertive structural and communicational clarity. At the same time, by detaching the words from any functional purpose, Walther allows them to float as images within the frames, conveying meaning as much through form as through linguistic association. Walther's abiding interest in the instructional value of diagrams, sketches, and graphic layout might seem to contradict his nurturing in the 1960s and 70s of an active viewer participant who, while guided by a clear set of parameters, was encouraged to challenge the artist's own agency. However, I want to suggest that these two tendencies, the control of the work's basic operational parameters and the relinquishment of authority, actually worked in tandem as Walther established a radical approach to authorship that helped to destabilize post-war dichotomies between objectivity and subjectivity and between functionalism and formalism in West German sculpture. In the decade before he took up a teaching post in 1970 at the Art Academy in Hamburg, Walther developed a sculptural language and set of terms for the formation of a revitalized viewing public. Yet despite his clear departure from sculptural tradition, Walther did not fully abandon Konrad Adenauer's post-war call to order and rejection of experimentation. Aspects of industrial standardization in Walther's work of the 1960s, which when viewed through the lens of his early education, bear some affinities with the desk-based learning he claimed to want to leave behind. As demonstrated by his recent string of large-scale career survey exhibitions, Walther has long reflected upon his past works as he has sought to identify a developmental through line in his practice. Already in 1972, in the first book that offered an overview of his work to date, he included drawings and paper-based studies that other artists might have considered too provisional to place within a growing corpus of images and objects. The products of class assignments, such as this drawing of packaging for an ordinary food item, occupy an important place in Walther's work monograph, edited by the curator Götz Adriani, who organized the accompanying exhibition in 1972 at the Kunsthalle Tübingen. They demonstrate Walther's early affinity for close observation of his everyday environment while illustrating his innate drawing skills. The earliest work included in the book is this pencil drawing of a bundle of string wrapped around a wooden stick. Its 1955 date establishes the fact that Walther's facility for drawing preceded his studies at the Hochschule. He would have been 15 or 16 when he produced this finely detailed image. As early as 1957, the year in which Walther entered the Hochschule, he showed signs of a changing attitude toward the position of objects in his conception of the work of art. These two drawings, included in the work monograph of a set of gear shafts seen from above in an oblique angle, convey technical precision and place the mechanical component in the exact center of the sheet of paper. One is a schematic line drawing that highlights the object's contours, while the other includes loosely applied pencil to indicate shading and texture. The drawings offer an image of the abundance of post-war industry, with a carefully crafted and purpose-driven machine component holding the promise of technological progress. According to the Tübingen catalog, not many of these early examples of Walther's initial training survived, which retroactively enhances the singularity of each image. Several pages later in the catalog, Götz includes a set of 12 drawings, and here are 4 of them, also from 1957, that forcefully shift attention from the center of the page to its edges. The repeated motif of simply rendered frames within frames must, as Walther explains in a caption, be considered as a group that signals, quote, support for the demand of the negation of traditional pictorial forms, end quote. The picture as a representation of fullness thus recedes in order to open up a blank slate upon which a reconstituted observer might project meaning. It is worth noting that this tentative gesture of emptying out initially takes place in a pictorial context, as in this pivotal image from 1960. From the perspective of 1957, Walther's multiple drawings and paintings of empty frames might then be read as marking a temporal holding pattern, a brief moment before he, along with others of his generation, found his way toward a sculptural vocabulary that displaced the field of projection onto real space. As Hans-Ulrich Gumbrecht wrote in his 2013 book on the moment of latency in post-war history, the mood, or to use his specific German term, Stimmung, of the years of Walther's education as an artist was defined by simultaneous, quote, feelings of congestion and easy forward momentum. The sense of steady historical progress relied, of course, on the economic recovery of West Germany during the 1960s, 50s and 60s. Congestion, on the other hand, speaks more broadly to a cultural experience of general unease, of unresolved trauma and buried potential. Walther's work emerges out of and reflects critically upon this conflicted temporality. His wall corners of 1963 mark out a space of potential on the wall of the studio, a site that Walther would never withdraw from, but to which he would no longer treat as the exclusive space for the production of his work. In her short but insightful contribution to the Shifting Perspectives exhibition catalog, Steph Heidhuis, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, an artist who studied with Walther at the Art Academy in Hamburg, writes about what she calls the dimension of possibility in Walther's work. Heidhuis locates a utopian element in Walther's merging of time, action, and ephemerality. This is a convincing account of what drew the artist to study with Walther. Yet as far as this dimension of possibility entails a projection into the future, it is never idealizing or even particularly concrete. There is no vision for a specific type of social order, no call for a particular political system. Instead, the temporality that structures his practice tends to look backward and forward at the same time, testing his strategies in relation to past artistic conventions as well as to his own growing body of work. Walther has tracked time by constantly maintaining a retrospective outlook. With the aid of a vast array of photographs of actions, drawings of past exhibition layouts, and written accounts of formative experiences, we can chart in detail Walther's gradual move from the self-contained tabletop study to the open space required by the elements of his first work set of 1963 to 69, the career-defining project that has formed the basis for the current ongoing reevaluation of his oeuvre. As we learn in photographic documentation of his early studio experiments, it is only a short leap from his multiple renditions of the image with the absent center to handheld objects that still keep a degree of two-dimensionality intact. These photographs, taken during Walther's studies under the painter Karl Otto Götz at the Kunstakademie Düsseldorf, show his interest in documenting a logical progression from the projective space of the picture to the haptic space of the body. With his first work set, Walther produced a fully realized group of objects that proposed a more embodied relationship with sculptural form. His notion of practice situations, the term he used in the foundational 1976 interview with Georg Jappe in Studio International, implied that these participatory actions would ultimately contribute to the social good. Indeed, the question of use or usefulness has long been posed in relation to his work, as is apparent in this 1975 exhibition review that describes his art as taking the audience beyond what the writer refers to as our everyday, quote, patterns of experience and thought, end quote. I find this question just as relevant today. To what extent can Walther's work guide the participant in imagining alternative forms of behavior and thinking? In her recent book, What's the Use?, Sarah Ahmed writes about a category of use that can be thought of as a contact zone, such as a footpath in nature that many individuals have helped to form over time. With the first work set, Walther displaced the passive, unified work of art with an active scene of labor performed by coordinated bodies moving alongside of and within the object. Many of these objects are thus, in a certain sense, contact zones, but they leave no physical trace, instead offering a relatively useless activity that nevertheless hints at a more humane, egalitarian, and purposeful mode of social interaction. Each element in the group carries its own title, the phrasing of which has, as a result of Walther's habitual tinkering with terminology, changed over the decades. For this particular item from 1967, Walther gave it, in his 1968 book, Objekte benutzen, or Objects Use, the unusually politically loaded title of Object to Understand Brutality. The act of filling the empty sleeves of the fabric square with hay does evoke a gesture of caring, of instantiating a fullness of the frame that implies softness and warmth in opposition to brutality and violence. Still, Walther disrupted the self-contained logic of the sculptural object only to remain partially anchored in a modernist structure of linear progress and productivity. This has to do with the way that the bodies of individuals and groups fall into line, arrange themselves in geometrical formations, and generally follow the artist's instructions. Should we be surprised or disappointed by his decision in 1982 to change the title to Sculpture 5 States? It certainly strips the objects of some of their earlier political and even emotional connotations, but then again, Walther does not make overt political claims for his work. Various writers have noted the regimented, sometimes even rigid relationship between Walther's participants and the objects in the work set, an experience that is counterbalanced by the forgiving edges of the cotton material and the slow contemplative pacing of the action. For all of the work's 1960s era emphasis on collectivity and cooperation, it never promotes a falsely emancipatory social space. Rather, the self-consciousness of the participant, who has only limited agency during these practice situations, allows a new relationship with the art object to take hold, a relationship that requires the viewer, as it has the artist, to search for the appropriate descriptive terms. Walther offered his objects as spaces of reflection that might at some point transform into spheres of action. However, his belated international reception would seem to indicate that the necessary frame of reference was not yet in place in the 1960s and 70s, such that he and his viewer participants could, for the time being, only practice. As with other artists of his generation, he sought to leave the past behind while acknowledging that the future was not yet at hand, compelling him in the present to pursue an art of preparation. This work, which in 1968 Walther called Preparation Object, has since 1982 been referred to as Sack and Hood. His alteration of the title downplays the implication of action and instead emphasizes the shapes and their relationship to common things. Does this terminological transformation prioritize a formal reading and foreclose the potential for social impact? Have museums contributed to what we might think of as the taming of these objects through their aestheticization? Or has Walther actually rescued formalism from its modernist associations with elitism, medium specificity, and the autonomy of the art object? Finally, now that Walther has been preparing his audience for over 60 years, how have we advanced, and what, if anything, can we recognize in the work today that could not be fully comprehended at the time? I hope to discuss these questions and others during our conversation. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Gregory.
Stop screen sharing. 1 sec. There you go.
It's the question I asked Yasmil, Christian, and Gregory. We should maybe put the questions at the end of the 3 discussions. What do you think? Yes.
Your questions.
Yeah, our question.
Yeah, I think so. Huh? Yes. I mean, whatever.
Better, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So yes, Neil, it's your turn then.
Well, thank you, Erik, and thank you for being here, all of you, and for the team at Hauts-de-France. I have some preliminary notes. I have to say, it's been 10 years now for me since I first worked on an exhibition with Franz, Erhard, Walther, and I realize it's still a work that I'm discovering as I think more and more about how it works in the world that we live today. And I wanted to begin by reminding us of the Avalanche insert, the pages in Avalanche from the spring of 1972, and how Franz Erhard Walther's work appear in this issue alongside already legendary artist Philip Glass and game changers, we can say emerging artists at that time, already quite well known, Robert Morris on one hand, Larry Levay on the other, and the dancer Yvonne Rainer. And this spread of images that again uses some of the images that Gregory was showing us, the black and white, the celebrated and quite famous now black and white photographs by Tim Roeder. These photographs have helped a lot on the understanding of what goes on in Franz's work. And I want to begin by talking a little bit about how that worked. It was 4-page spread in the magazine. It includes selections of sequences of the photographs of certain items in the first work set. And it showed Franz and Walther in it, along with participants. They are using the instruments, as he calls these pieces from the work set. And in particular, I want to start with the first image, which is an image of the item number 26. And like Gregory pointed out, the subtitles of these items change over time. So it's sort of hard to know what to say are their subtitle, but we're just gonna say number 26. And what we see in the first photograph is that they are participants. There are 3 people on their knees. They are on a carpet, and they're all touching the cloth piece. And then 2 people are standing, observing them. One seems to be directing the situation, while another is just looking down onto what's going on, this unfolding of the cloth. And the action documented in these photographs is what Franz calls his work process. So watching, observing, something being unfolded, and others acting on it. And I think that it is here in this instance that we see how this instrument to be used, is composed. We understand from the images from the 4 photographs that the bodies and their movement of the body is what unfolds the situation, that there's an activity going on. We have no access to knowing what kind of sounds were made or what kind of instructions were said or words were uttered, but we understand it almost as a choreography. We see the images, and he positioned the images in the layout of the page as such, as almost like film stills. So we see the opening of the work, the holding together the work in stillness, and then we see the work being put down. What I was also interested in this avalanche issue is that his writing is included. And this is the elasticity about Franz's work that we find so fascinating, that from the beginning, works, drawings, images come together with language. So his great affinity and love for the English language, I would say, and also the German language, obviously his mother tongue, but also the English language. This is something that I find always again and again so exciting about him, that early on he embraces this bilingual condition, and in this allowed him a great vehicle to participate in an international arena of the art world at that time and still today. So the pages are organized carefully, and across the page we see the images, and below them are these captions. And I find it really intriguing that alongside with the title, number 26 from 1967, he puts just terms. He throws in the term head body, interval, work set. These terms are part of what I call the Waltherian lexicon. They appear again and again in drawings, and they are left for us to conjure their meaning. And we sense that it is in these terms that he gives us instructions as to what goes on here. So by the time you reach the 4th image and the last on the page spread, we see the participants walking away. You get a sense of the work is done. And perhaps also you read in their body language exhaustion. There's a gesture, someone with a hand on the head, that gesture of tiredness. And I read these images now based on my own experience of being in the work of Franz and Walther on multiple occasions, to know that these are the emotions one goes through, that there are the physical demands of the work also comes with emotional demands, and that a demonstration of a Franz Erhard Walther is exactly how we see it in these photographs, that they take time, there's an element of improvisation, and that you're drawing up something, right? You're drawing up a space, you're drawing up a moment, and that demands some effort, some energy, some physical and psychological demand. So the act of composing something with fabric, I was thinking, yeah, that is, that there's nothing unfamiliar or absurd about seeing a group of people holding a piece of fabric. We see them when people are raising a flag. We see it when a group of people are installing a tent in a forest, or also in your own home. If you are folding the linens, you have perhaps made the experience that it's far easier and efficient if you do it with another person. So the actual action of folding and unfolding a piece of cloth is not so bizarre. But somehow we have been, for generations now, told this idea of being independent, of being self-sufficient, of living autonomous lives in which we are to erect our own tent in the wood and also fold our own linens on our own. And so and somehow we have come to believe that that is possible, doable, and even better than doing it with others. And I think it is here in this conjurer that Franz comes and puts the surprise on us, that actually there are certain things that are meant to be done with other people. And it is in that zone in which we arrive to the moment of surprise at the museum, when we are forced to confront that actually what is expected of us is not to be independent, not to be in solitude, not to be self-sufficient, but to look for a person in the gallery, perhaps a stranger, or perhaps the person who came with you to see the show, to join you in the activity of unfolding a work set. And here is where surprise, I feel, takes over. And so could Walther's first work set had changed the course of history? I often ask myself the question when I fantasize about how things could have gone differently. Had he managed to manufacture unlimited editions of his first work set, where each one of us would have had this in our home to use among our friends. And why do I have this fantasy? Well, days like today, when we are in a lockdown here in Frankfurt, in a light lockdown, I would have loved to have a work set in my home to play it out, put it in a situation with people who are close to me. Because Franz had this sentence that he wrote, that the work set, and I think this applied to his work in general, were made with a sense of responsibility. He said, and he says, I am involved in a collective situation, which I have in part created. I am responsible to others. The situation collapses if I withdraw. At the same time, this is the contradiction that he often swings in his statements. And he says, the instrument does not force me to feel responsible to the others. The participants can create a situation which involves no responsibility to others. So here I see is this dialectic that Franz has with language, but also with the idea of what art is. Is it to be used? Perhaps. If it's used, he's saying that he is responsible for those actions, that they collapse if he's not there. And yet he says, but the participants can create a situation which involves no responsibility of others. I am very interested in thinking of Franz's work in this idea of responsibility and action. for tonight, I thought to put the words together, drawing up, common ground, because this phrasal verb to draw up, which in English it's a combination of, right? When you use a phrasal verb, you are combining a verb with other categories, a particle, a preposition, an adverb, to compose a unit. And I think with Franz's work, you have this effect of a phrasal verb that is composed and formulated in a time and in a space, and that operates with this tension of not being a verb alone and not being an adverb, but being in this construction. I find that this is something that he does greater when we are asked to discuss the language that he uses with the forms that he generates and with the representations that he puts out in his drawings, for example. And I think it is here in this triangle, like often is being said in other literature, that Franz operates in this three-point structure of language, image, and form, which adds to that, we can add a fourth dimension, the space. It is in this tension of all of this pulling for direction of meaning that I find in him, in his work, in his practice, a political dimension, because it demands from us, the viewer and the thinking being in the work, in front of the work, a decision to whether be in it or stay out of it. And this intention, this invitation has an intention to put an antidote to absent, disengaged thinker, and what could be called a non-thinker. Yeah, and he's forcing us into the direction of, even if you make the choice not to join into the action, into the demonstration, then look how the words, funny words that he has used over time, not to join the demonstration. If you choose not to do that, then you are also acting on a decision. You are making an active thinking and a decision in it. So perhaps my remarks tonight are just impacted by this long period of isolation and of distancing, on unnatural living in a distance from one another that feels monastic and non-common, non-liberating, non-emancipatory moment in which we live. And I look forward to the reversal of this time, where we can engage again in reciprocal presence, connecting through thinking and being, and following how Franz's work has demonstrated that we can draw on our energy, draw up from our energy to reach a common ground and a common good. So these are my thoughts for tonight on his work. Thanks.
Thank you a lot, Yasmil. There will be a lot to discuss, I think. Christian, your turn.
Thank you, Erik, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you to Jana and Andrea and everyone at Hauts-de-France for setting this up. Coincidentally, the opening of this exhibition in early March was my last international travel, and I basically returned to New York the next day, and 2 days later, everything shut down. So it feels a very strange, but also a very fitting kind of circle to return back to the exhibition after several months of lockdown and isolation, and think about what happened and what I saw on my last travel in March. So this is a wonderful opportunity. What I'm going to talk about is in many ways a variation on an argument that I've made elsewhere, in which I've situated Franz Erhard Walther's work around the time of his years in New York, against the backdrop of the vital and competing artistic tendencies of 1960s New York, as, if you will, an extended negotiation between the legacies of abstract expressionism on the one hand, and the primacy of minimalism, performance art, and conceptual art on the other, the struggle between painting and sculpture, if you will. Walther's own artistic trajectory, I think, mirrors in this course quite closely, with early work aiming to expand the convention of informel and abstract expressionism, and the breakthrough of his formative early mature works located exactly at the fault line of painting, sculpture, and the new artistic experiments of the 1960s. And Gregory, you've written beautifully about those early drawings that are exactly situated at that intersection. His early works of the years 1961 to 1963, for instance, immediately preceding Walther's most iconic work of the first work set from 63 to 69, can be understood as a crucial moment in Walther's oeuvre, when a first decisive shift from the pictorial conventions of post-war abstraction toward the material and process-driven operations of minimal and post-minimal art occurred. Walther's Papierfaltungen, or paper foldings from 1962, for instance, produced by folding and unfolding a large sheet of paper 6 times to produce a grid of 16 fields, or his 16 Lufteinschlüsse from the same year, 16 pillows of air trapped between 2 sheets of paper sealed with glue around all 4 edges, both combine the logic of the grid with the primacy of the material manipulation. It is commonly understood to locate this shift as a struggle to abandon the conventions of abstract painting in favor of sculpture, performance, and conceptual art. And Walther himself acknowledged this struggle, however obliquely, in an interview with Ulrike Müller from 2005, and I quote, "At Documenta 2 in 1959, I first saw originals by Jackson Pollock, Barnett Newman, Willem de Kooning, Mark Rothko, and Robert Rauschenberg. How fresh this New York school looked compared to the ingratiating École de Paris. I moved to New York in 1967, and the work that I had been developing since the early 1960s found a place in this inspiring, optimistic atmosphere. However, there was a tendency in New York to subsume the manifestations of art under definitions, and my pieces did not quite fit in. They were not minimal art, even though they seemed to contain such forms. They were not conceptual art, though they were conceptual. They were not body art, though the body is present in the actions. They could not be counted as performance, though they have an innate performative quality." The unease Walther expresses about the lack of categorical clarity of his works of that time shimmers with echoes of the discussions about the proper role and definition of art in its variant disciplines in the 1960s. The contestations about the relationships and differences between painting and object, sculpture and performance, artwork and viewer, and so on, which had come to a heated crescendo around the time Walther arrived in New York in 1967, are well rehearsed, and I will not go into detail here. Instead, I want to follow a thought line Katie Siegel and David Reed have proposed in their 2006 traveling exhibitions entitled High Times, Hard Times, New York Painting, 1967 to 1975, which looked at the condition painting found itself in New York during these years, a condition generally rendered as irrelevant, in retreat, exhausted, derrière garde, or in crisis. In her introductory essay, Siegel reiterates the now familiar narrative of the late 1960s art world, and I quote, "Familiar chronicles of the late 1960s and 1970s emphasize both new mediums and the exhaustion of older mediums and histories, primarily the dead end of painting, particularly as defined and historicized during the 1950s as a reductive, formalist enterprise. This created a complex and even contradictory situation, of course, for artists engaged with abstract painting both at the time and subsequently. If the possibilities lay outside painting, what to do? Some, like Milton Resnick and Kenneth Noland, retrenched, insisting that mining second or third generation abstract expressionism was the serious, if unfashionable, route to take. Others, such as Richard Serra and Alan Capro, quit painting to pursue sculpture, performance, or conceptual art. These two routes, almost two sides of the same coin, are accounted for in histories of the time. In their definitiveness, in the certainty of their positions, one must paint, one cannot paint. They lend themselves to current modes of writing art history based on either-or propositions and sudden historical breaks, end quote. But what Siegel and her curatorial collaborator, the artist David Reed, suggested instead is a vitality and experimentation in painting that draws from a newly found freedom in its marginalization, and from the shifting intellectual ground that was prepared by the discussion about objects, materials, composition, and form that artists like Donald Judd and Robert Morris had explored. Painting here no longer served as the flat optical foil, literally the ground, against which new approaches in object-based art could be enacted. Rather, painting began to insist on its material condition, on its reliance and visibility of process, and its ability to incorporate disparate attitudes toward the definition of a unified picture plane. Against the antagonism, one must paint, one cannot paint, Siegel proposes an understanding of painting's possibilities that is defined by permissiveness, not restriction. And I quote again, "The very possibility and ubiquity of fluidity among mediums also signaled an end to the definition of painting in its medium-specific maximum security incarnation. That is, maybe painting wasn't at an end, defeated by sculpture, but only a certain definition of painting. And perhaps painting even benefited from the liberation that this entailed," end quote. Most strikingly, Siegel and Reed opened up the cast of protagonists, bringing into view women artists, African-American artists, and foreigners living in New York to suggest that, paradoxically, the former chief discipline of painting had become marginal enough to be recognized and utilized by a group of ambitious artists who found themselves on the margins. Elizabeth Murray and Mary Heilman, Linda Banglis and Dorothea Rockburn, Al Loving and Jack Whitten, Sam Gilliam and Alan Shields, Michael Venezia and Roy Comer, Pat Steer and Ron Gorchow, as well as Germans like Blinky Palermo and Franz-Erhard Walther, all serve as a cast of artists proudly operating on the edges of painting. Some literally working along the very boundaries of where a painting ceases to be reasonably called as such, others by infusing their pictorial practice with wider or more urgent desires and passions, from feminism to civil rights. Siegel and Reed defined the project of High Times, Hard Times as a drastic expansion of the concept of painting. The included artists could be understood as examples for the various ways in which painting as practice and object can be altered. Tools used, from squeegees to sticks, different kinds and forms of paint application, pouring, spraying, rubbing paint onto the support, to the dense gallery of, quote, things to do with canvas that provide maybe the most direct place for Walther's work in this context. Here, the limp, basically sculptural forms of unstretched canvas that Sam Gilliam employed to great effect. Richard Tuttle's muted, dyed, irregularly shaped and simply tacked up canvases, Palermo's Stoffbilder, and Walther's various objects included in the show unify only when considered as different examples of canvas application. Understood this way, as a kind of canvas in the expanded field, Siegel and Reed's definition of painting in the late 1960s and early 1970s suggests a context for Walther's work that might give shelter to the unease he expressed to Ulrike Müller in the passage quoted earlier. After all, Walther did not shift his practice after his move to New York, but encountered a different audience and context for it. Take the first work set, for example. Begun in 1963, 41 objects of the total 58 are dated 63 to 67 and presumably predate Walther's arrival in New York. The remaining 17 objects, dated 1968 to 1969, were produced or finished in New York. What is striking is that there's no perceptible difference in the materials, construction, or intention of the works made in New York. Rather, they appear as a continuation of a concept fully formed by the time of his arrival. If anything, the number of works intended to be used by multiple persons, from 2 to 10, seemed to increase in frequency, suggesting that as the work neared its conclusion in the series, the dialogical or communal aspects became emboldened. What to me is most striking is their color. Unlike the bold colors of red, yellow, blue, and orange, shades of primary and secondary colors that are so distinctive and vivid in most of Walther's later work, these 58 objects have a muted range. Their colors go from an unbleached off-white to various shades of dark red, dark green, dark gray, black, and gray-green. The utilitarian and slightly militaristic air suggests a color scheme that Walther brought to New York from the landscape of his upbringing. The shades of green, brown, and gray of the open fields and forest clearings of the Rhön, into which Walther often ventured to enact his objects for the documentary eye of the camera. And Gregory, you showed some, and it's very nice to have them here. I think these photographs in many ways are absolutely crucial to the discussion. And it's interesting that they're all black and white. Otherwise, I think the kind of color similarities between the objects and the landscapes would immediately become much more apparent. Crucially, their color in the context of an expanded definition of painting must be understood as an inherent rather than an applied quality. The dye being literally within the fabric itself, not applied in a gesture of pictorial choice, and being inseparable from the material itself. And I think the same would go for the objects in the landscape. Just as importantly, Walther's use of these fabrics distinguishes itself fundamentally from the work of another German artist who moved to New York a few years after Walther. Blinky Palermo, whose Stoffbilder or fabric paintings date to almost exactly the same period of the work set, 66 to 72. Even though Palermo also used store-bought fabrics that would be sewn together to form blocks of 2 or 3 contrasting colored fields, which are then stretched onto canvas, Palermo conceived of his Stoffbilder fundamentally as painterly, as pictorial objects. Ultimately, Palermo simply used the fabrics as a novel way to update the monochrome compositional field with the ready-made material sensibility of minimalism. No internal logic between the fabric and its colors exists, and the colors, although often the given dyes of the acquired fabrics, do not read as materially inherent, but simply as pictorially convenient. All of this is to say that support, color, composition, context are all inherently painterly categories that could be applied to Walther's objects. What distinguishes them from Siegel and Reed's argument of painterly practice as material experimentation is Walther's consistency of material choices and consideration of color based on context. If the first work set is indeed influenced in their coloration and initial staging by Walther's experience of the Rhön landscapes, a reference that must have read as unfamiliar in 1960s New York, the strong colors of his later work would have been clearly understood by Donald Judd or Sam Gilliam and might be situated at home in the lofts and galleries of Soho. They update notions of the monumental color field and the monochrome reductions, while expanding the use of canvas from support to container. And maybe they allow the suggestion of a sightedness of color, a reference to the natural landscapes and industrial environments that defined Walther's trajectory of the 1960s. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Christian. Wow. Okay. Shall we start with Gregory?
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, Gregory, the question I wanted to ask you, but there are some familiarities with Christian's intervention, is that this relation to painting and early works in Walther's work is more complex than we think, and then that the art history might have told us. So this, how can we say, this phantasm of a shift from painting to a kind of minimalistic practice is not so evident. And what also interests me is what you told us about this changes of titles in the 80s. Do you think it's also related to the context of this of the Bilderstreit in the 80s and this return of painting and so on, and this formal aspect that comes back? Do you think you can contextualize this?
Okay, so I guess to the first question, which is a kind of big question, maybe you can pinpoint a little bit more what you mean by what's been overlooked in that relationship between painting and sculpture in the histories that have been told. Are you referring to something specific, or you mean more generally that painting remains a key component of his practice and how we need to read it in the present?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think another way to look at it, yes, I mean, I agree. And I think Christian just laid out why we need to keep the medium of painting in mind always when we're thinking about the extent to which Walther is a sculptor. But I think in another way, you could think about his work generally being pictorial or being based on image-making strategies as much as it's based on object-making strategies. Because, you know, he's always been so attuned to not only recording through diagrams and documents and drawings in 2 dimensions, how these works might be used, how they have been used, how they might function, the purpose they might serve eventually, as sort of prototypes for something that would be produced on a larger scale, as Yasmil was bringing up, and that's another really interesting idea. But I think it's also the relationship to photography from early stages of his work, and not just with the photographs from Tim Rautert, but also his own attentiveness to recording photographically, documenting this process. I mean, even those photographs, the wall corners, that photo of him in the studio, I love that image, and there's several of them where it's an image of a certain performative action where he's on the ground in front installing these things, but they themselves are marking out a pictorial space that is contained within the space of the photograph. And so I guess you can, painting is just one point on a spectrum of pictoriality and image making practices within his larger body of work. Now, as that then maybe brings us up to the question of titling. I mean, that's something, and it was really helpful to have access to your recent book, Erik, which I just got, by the way, so I haven't read the essay in detail, but when you were, you lay out the trajectory of how he changed the titles over time, and they didn't just change once, as you make clear, they sometimes changed 2, 3, or 4 times over the years. And in many of them, and I can't say that this applies uniformly, but many of them change from titles that are more evocative of action, that are more evocative of social space, that speak to the performative side of the work or the potential social ramifications of the work, and move more toward a description of the forms. And that's something I was trying to draw out here. Now, how that might relate to this early 80s, whether we talk about a resurgence of painting in Europe and in the US in particular in the late 70s and early 80s, or we talk about the Bilderstreit, particularly in Germany or West Germany at the time. I'm not entirely sure how this would, I don't know, I haven't thought this through. I don't know to what extent his work was talked about in that context. I guess you'd have to really look at his wall formations of the 80s to start thinking that through, where the work really is pressed up against the wall and is something that, to my knowledge, is not entered into as regularly as the objects, physically encountered as regularly as the objects in the first work sets. I may be wrong about that, but I've not seen them activated too frequently. And when they have been activated, it's usually by the artist and or the curator of an exhibition. In other words, more geared to a very sort of singular demonstration rather than used by multiple visitors during the course of a show. So I suppose they become even more static in that sense, and one does tend to observe them from a distance. And given their scale too, you really think about some of the issues that were at stake in the late 70s and 80s as painting became such a dominant player in the market. And so I don't know, that's a question we should actually pose to Franz, Franz Erhard Walther, to see if 82 is a particular year in which he was thinking through these issues in relation to other developments in the art world at the time. Are you aware of these? Something I'm not as familiar with.
I don't know. I don't have it. We should ask him the question. Yeah. But it's certainly related to those years, I think. Yes, because it was also the year of the Rudi Fuchs Documenta.
Yep.
So where he participated and something changed, I think.
Yeah, and right after Hunger nach Bildern came out, and I mean, this, in a way, this is sort of the European extension of some of the history that Christian was laying out, and maybe to some extent. Do you see a connection there, Christian?
I don't know. I mean, I wonder to what extent by that time Franz's objects and he sort of like his artistic status, so to speak, where on that sliding continuum they would be situated. Because I think so much when I think of that early 80s discussion, it really kind of denotes the beginning of something of a conservative shift, if you will. Mm-hmm. It's the year of the geistig-moralische Wende and Helmut Kohl coming into office, and Documenta 7, Rudi Fuchs's Documenta, being so much about these kind of erratic spaces of the gold room, the silver room, and so on. Really these ideas of a kind of preciousness and a return of a certain kind of formalism. And I wonder if Franz's success as an artist by that time maybe kind of shifted the reading of his work from that period away from an emphasis of the kind of experimental and sort of like intersectional nature of the works towards more of a kind of monumental, established, somewhat, a kind of like, I wonder if the discussion of that moment positions him in a position of a kind of on the conservative side or the progressive side of the argument, so to speak, even though the work contains different answers. I think the public perception may have been one that puts him closer to, I don't know, Richard Serra, say, than Yvonne Rainer, if you will. So that's. I mean, I was 11 at the time, so it's a little early for me to really clearly have a sense of memory of that, from my own perspective. But yeah. But
certainly the paintings and their abstraction, and their abstractness, they definitely do not take part in the debates around neo-expressionism, of gestural painting, big, splashy, muscular forms of painting. If anything, they're much more attached to a legacy of abstraction. And what adds to these works, the wall formations, that it's a kind of intermediary figure, is that of the body of the person entering them is often also wearing something, and usually in the same color as the wall formation itself. And so there's this kind of, I guess, maybe to come back to the first part of your question, Erik, it does then trouble the idea that sculpture is really the dominant term here, because now you're embodying painting. as much as you're embodying sculpture.
Right. I guess the question is, if you look at that moment, do you look at that moment through the lens of painting, or do you look at it through the lens of a kind of similar discussion that happened in sculpture in Germany at the same time, that I think also played itself out with people like, I don't know, Gerhard Merz and Günter Förk, you know, as like two positions at that time, where a kind of monumentality and a language of abstraction all of a sudden became articulated with a question of power, you know, where kind of a reference to reductivist or formalist traditions of the avant-garde became less associated with Bauhaus and more associated with fascism. And so, you know, you have these kind of the re-articulation of all these languages at that time through the lens of a kind of neoconservative impulse that plays itself out in a kind of privileging of certain expressive tendencies in figurative painting and expressive painting, but also through the articulation of certain abstract tendencies in sculpture by emphasizing kind of monumentality, by emphasizing blankness, by emphasizing power, by emphasizing kind of rationality as a discourse that kind of has this through line from, say, Terragni to Mussolini or something like that. And so how Walther's work plays itself within that particular moment in the first half of the 1980s is not something that I have an answer to, but I've never thought about it that way. So it's a strange detour that our conversation is taking, but I find it interesting.
But I guess, Christian, that the trick here was fabric.
Mm-hmm.
That the red herring here is that where those guys were using, you know, monumental scale, but also materials that have a certain novelty and a certain power. Here comes Franz with a material that in itself has brings a political question. Mm-hmm. It doesn't sit well among the big guys that he was using fabric. And still, I think those large works from the 80s, they dismantled that ego trip of that whole generation. When you are in front of Franz's work, there is, radicality, a neo-feminism coming out of it that is strange and that does not speak to that macho generation. I don't know. I still find the work really rebellious, even in the 80s. And I think it's the fabric and the colors. It's not sitting well with Richard Serra, let's say.
So Yasmil, you would say that there's a kind of contradiction and a kind of dialectic, as you said also in your speech, in those works?
Yeah, I think Franz is constantly, he's a trickster without being, not in a humble way. I would say that in the work, I find it, it's always forgiving that he suggests something and at the same time puts a question mark. I feel like it's maybe there's an anarchic vein in Franz's practice. He does not want to answer that, right? He does. I feel like the work constantly resists making a big claim. In a way, I almost feel like he writes in lowercase letters.
That would be his conception of responsibility.
Yeah.
Except so many of his drawings, Werkzeichnungen, use uppercase block lettering. I mean, many of them do.
But then it's also all uppercase, all caps.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like there is something always, when he wears a red shirt, that you always know that he's resisting a certain code of behavior that is expected here in the culture where he grew up. And he comes to the opening with the red shirt.
Well,
So
I
the
mean,
famous red shirt, yes.
but like if we think about the shirt, and we, you know, that starts getting you thinking about things that are mass produced. I'm interested in your idea of the prototype, or the potential for mass production, because you know, that's in some ways that's carrying on a kind of dialectic that appeared in the Bauhaus, you know, between the craft artisanal object and the hope to mass produce out of objects that still had the quality and the tactile appeal of the more artisanal kind of workshop produced objects.
Yeah, I think if he was doing it today, knowing what we know, and artists, we have a number of references of artists who are doing really large scale productions. He could have done it. I feel like there's an energy in the work that makes that suggestion clear to me. In that I think of like Lucio Fontana, 68, when he inserted the multiple along with the book of his book. And that was for everybody who could buy it. It was unlimited, right? And unfortunately, Fontana died that year. But I have a sense from the fact that Franz started with 10 for the work sets, for example. But then he did other pieces that were smaller, like the book, that he also did on a larger edition number. That had he had the support of a manufacturing, we could ask him, this will be my question for him. Had he had the support of a nice German family-sized manufacturing company, had he gone to produce these on a larger scale for all people? And the reason I have this feeling and thinking about it is that it makes me think that the ambition in the pieces like the work set, and even later, and even singular pieces, suggests his ambition was to reach a larger number of people. And then recently, I remember a conversation about the lending of the work. Does anybody remember this? That at one point, Franz thought that you could borrow actually the work sets, that you could
from museums, or
museums. So this idea of a human, a civilian, borrowing a work of art, this already gave me the sense that we should ask him if he had ever thought about mass production, because if he already had the idea that visitors could enter a contract with a museum and borrow a work.
He thought about it, I think, but it was just too complicated also on the technical aspect. You know, he just wanted Johanna to make the pieces, and he could have not, industry could have, it would have been possible for him. So he was very attached to this craftsmanship, but he wanted also the thing to be democratic, but it didn't work. You know, he couldn't find the equation between the two. It wasn't possible.
Uniclo?
I have a question I have a feeling our conversation is touching upon two different aspects in a way. On the one hand, it's where we've talked a lot about in our presentations about these moments of kind of expansion and intersection of, you know, various disciplines where performance and the object and painting and drawing and installation and performance and interaction and documentation all kind of overlap, and the difficulty of determining the proper place or the proper term of the work, and that there is maybe an ambiguity or an evasiveness within the kind of categorical conditions of the work, and a shiftingness or an insistence that that relationship is always more complicated than an either or. And I think, Yasmil, you've reminded us a lot about the ethics of the work and the kind of like the aspects of choice that underlies a kind of democracy, if you will, that you've just brought up the kind of democratization of the art object through mass production and dissemination. But earlier you were talking about something which I think still rings with me, which is that the works are designed in such a way that they force you or require you to make a choice in your relation toward them, that you can choose to participate or not. You can choose to observe or enact, but that those choices, even though, there are choices of participation or non-participation, of engagement or non-engagement, but both are in a way valid choices within a democratic society and a democratic procedure. And so I wonder if we can find a way to kind of bring together or to think together the kind of material and procedural and categorical kind of openness and ambiguity of the work, and the insistence on open-endedness in what it is as a kind of an object, and in a way the insistence on a certain kind of choice that you have to make as a viewer and as a participant. So there's a kind of an ethics of possibility, materially speaking, but an ethics of kind of taking responsibility that the work engenders in all of us. And they seem to be related to me, but also oppositional in some way. And I can't bring them together more than that. But Yasmil, I rely on you to bring your wisdom to this.
You know how I came to learn the name of Franz, Erhard, Walther through Tino Segal.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the first time I heard of Franz, was in Minneapolis when Tino Segal came in 2006 or 7 to do a residency preparations for his show there. And he mentioned Franz. And so for me it was really revelatory to go to library and to look up the Walther had some books on Franz, and multiple actually, and then it made me understand that how Tino was describing the trajectory from the Situationist International to his reality in use of dance. And as a form to create, construct situations. And then it was clearer to me because I think that's what it's all about. It's game theory with Franz. I have the impression from experiencing the work and working with him that, and even his use of language, it comes from a game, from almost theories of games, and wanting to incite an action or trigger an action to construct a number of activities around it. And that has to be open-ended because there's, in this game, the game is no rules. So I feel like it's how he, so it's my way of reading the work through my encounter of Tino first into Franz. That's how I read it, almost like anachronistically, that theories of game that have been important to Tino Segal actually were first experienced in Franz's work.
But your mention of rules, I think, is important in this context too, because all the best games have really explicit rules. And I think Franz, I mean, in some ways, his reliance on rules and on procedures and on instructions actually puts it closer to a traditional game with a set of clear objectives and boundaries, except for with the game, you know what you're trying to achieve, whereas with his work, that's where the open-endedness comes in. There's no objective, there's no clear outcome. And I think the rules play out both on the level of each individual piece and how they're meant to be interacted with, but also in the institutional context, the actually rather limited access we have to these works. I mean, I remember participating with some of the objects in the first work set in your exhibition at DIA, where, if I'm not mistaken, we were using the actual edition rather than a copy of it. Whereas in more recent iterations, I think we're now using copies because of the number of people who are using them. And so, you know, this is, in terms of the ethics and all of this, to come back to Erik's point, or to come back to Christian's point, I think the institution is an enormous part of this, and especially in all these recent iterations of these works. I mean, if you think about how the work would have been engaged in the Spaces exhibition in New York, where it was more loose and tactile and maybe a little bit more anarchic, you know, although he was there to guide the experience. And then I suppose I don't know enough about the exhibition history to see how that has tracked over time, but you know, it's noteworthy that your exhibition of the first work set at DIA was, I think, the first time that work had been shown at DIA, despite having been in the collection for quite a long time, right?
Yeah. This is a good question also for Franz, because I've always wanted to, in a way, I think he has answered it on other occasions, but somehow I don't seem to remember exactly what triggered the decision of coming up with the storage mode, right? Because that was also my first encounter with the actual first work set was in Geneva, where they were in storage mode, put into cabinet. And I wonder if something happened after the 70s. It would be good to know where the contact with the institution. I think that's a great topic that I don't think I have read about it yet. Maybe correct me if I'm wrong, Erik, if someone has written about institution power in relationship to the reception of Franz's work, or institution restraints, right? This almost like his work is so anarchic that pushes for an institutional critique without meaning, like without being his intention to do an institutional critique, but it is pointing to an institutional critique when the work is not being allowed to be used, when the work is not exhibited how it was intended, and so on. But I haven't read anything, anybody taking on the question of institutional critique in the work.
But it started already in the 60s, I think. There was already a conflictual and complex relation to the institution. One text is very interesting. This New Yorker Tagebuch, this New Yorker diary he wrote after the Spaces exhibition, where this question of the rule is also very important, because he's not a real anarchist, because he puts very clear rules also. So I think, and also to come back to what Christian said between those two poles, those two ethical poles, I think that language has a big role to connect both polarities in Franz's work. So this political and ethic dimension, and this material and activation thing, you know.
Lots of contradiction, lots of great contradictions. I think that's
and I think in the three speeches we heard now, in your speech and in Gregory's and in Christian's speech, this question of contradiction in this work, this tension, this struggle is very important. I think this is really a key thing in Franz's work, you know, till now.
Well, I'm glad, Yasmil, you mentioned the role of storage, you know, and this idea of kind of stored potential, the depot. I mean, of course, this starts getting you one to think about his relationship to various other people he encountered at the academy in Düsseldorf. Obviously, boys could come into that conversation, but also someone like Emi Knöbel and his Room 19. I mean, that's another aspect of this moment. And it becomes quite visible in Franz's work in this because it's not just when the things are unpacked, it's what they look like too when they're wrapped up. And the attention paid to the container, to the packaging, which is effectively the same material as, or at least in most cases, I think the same material as the contents. And so that kind of relationship between inside and outside, between use and non-use, between potentiality and actuality, form a set of contradictions throughout his work, or productive tensions is maybe another way to put it. But I'm still, that's something I feel like I need to engage with more at length, is the idea of, you know, the sort of mode, the mode of storage, and the factor of potentiality, because even the activations themselves are more about suggesting potential rather than actualizing any particular outcome. So somewhere in there, even when they're being used or performed or demonstrated rather, they are not aiming toward any sort of, there's no telos there. There's no specific outcome. It's the process that suggests maybe other kinds of processes, other kinds of potentialities in other contexts.
I also think that an aspect of these, and with the work sets in particular, the privacy, it seems like this is a topic that I never got to discuss with Franz, of how it felt at the beginning, or how it was at the beginning when he had 4 people, to say, in participants, 4 participants, 5 participants, that he knew, and what was the difference when he did this at, you know, at Düsseldorf Academy or at Documenta, where all of a sudden it's a huge spectacle. People are observing and watching your endurance, because in some of these works you just have to wait. Yeah, you have to have a lot of tolerance and to wait what happens, to see the thing unfold, to experience what is this dimensional space that you go when you're performing it, or when you're not performing it, but using it. Okay, I guess it's the right term. But when other people are watching you, how did that affected his conception of the demonstration? Something about it, because early on when Heiner Friedrich acquired the work for Dia at that time, he was representing France and early on, and then stopped. But the work, that's how it entered the collection. There was the thought of making a museum dedicated just for the work set. So the idea was, perhaps was Heiner's idea, something to discuss with Franz. If he was here with us, we will get short answer if that was his idea or Heiner's idea. But that gives me the sense that there was also the idea that this was a place you went to do works. Almost like you go to yoga, or you go to a place to meditate, and you could go and do the work set.
Or to the Rothko Chapel or something like that, you know. Yeah. I've never heard that. It's interesting.
There's some drawings in the archive of the Dia Foundation about it, some documents, paper documents, because it was supposed to be in Haarlem.
I think, Christian, didn't you say, oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No.
Sorry. Didn't you say some things in another talk, or maybe in a conversation, about the Spaces show and how that was important for Walther in understanding how he wanted his audience to interact with these objects? And didn't he have to make some changes along the way?
I mean, I don't remember exactly sort of how that played itself out, but it's, I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the Spaces show is the way it was located at the back of the museum, with this sort of, you know, glass, basically like you were in a storefront at the museum, and you had to go into the room and sign up at a calendar in order to get a slot during which time to sort of interact with the works. But you're also completely on display, because there was a giant window where everybody could see you interacting with it. So it had this, it had this very particular kind of relationship between kind of public performative aspect and a kind of like personal, private relationship to the work. And I seem to recall that in one conversation that I had with Franz when after I was able to acquire the first work set for MoMA and then restaged the work there in 2011, which was, you know, basically the first time that the work had returned back to the Museum of Modern Art since it was shown there in 1969, and Franz came and re-performed some of the works at the Museum of Modern Art. And, you know, we had kind of ghost pieces, replicas there as well for the audience to interact with. But one of the things that he was talking about was that the ultimately frustrating or difficult or most difficult part was to find a way to explain how to set the boundaries for how an object was supposed to function, and then to allow the participants to find their own freedom within that. So I think you're exactly right, Gregory, that you're pointing out to the kind of, to the strictness and rule-based aspects that these works have. They're not just, you know, they're not there for like free expression and you use them in every which way you want to. There's a kind of, there's a right way to engage with these objects. And so that right way needs to be transmitted in a way that it doesn't become a strict kind of order, like do this, do that, but that within that right proper way of using the object, you can then sort of like modulate and find your own freedom within that. And I think that that kind of relationship is in a way the most difficult and the most frustrating aspect in kind of articulating that relationship between object and participant in a way. And I somehow recall that I think the storage solution came out of that frustration. To find the storage form was a way of saying it becomes too difficult to have that conversation every single time the work gets activated. So let's find a different form of presenting it, because otherwise these objects are just sort of scattered on the floor, and that's not the right way I want these works to be. They're not a bas-relief, they're not a scatter piece, they're not, you know, they're not about sort of the arbitrary or random distribution of objects on the floor. That's just the kind of the entropic state that they acquire after use. But if you can't use them, then let's find a different form for them. So in a funny way, Yasmil, you and I were thinking about the question of the storage exactly at the same time. It also reminded me, Gregory, when you were talking about other artists like Blinky, like Imi Knöbel and others, and boys kind of thinking about that, I immediately had to think of an early Thomas Schutte work from 1978 called Lager, which is essentially a storage of all these monochrome paintings leaning against the wall, you know, which is, I think in a way, it would also be interesting to look at the sort of subsequent generation of German artists coming out of that discussion, either directly as students of Franz or as people who just had to grapple with the kind of propositions that the works proposed within a context of, you know, post-1960s German art history, where the work just acquired a force that you had to take a position towards.
Well, it's just remarkable. I know we have to wrap up, but it's just remarkable to think that this imposition of rules, the need to impose rules and come up with procedures, happens at the exact moment where rules and procedures are being broken around the world and resisted, you know, in the late 1960s. Yeah. There's another way in which he's, you know, in his moment and out of his moment historically at a lot of different points in his career.
Right. Organizing freedom, to quote David Eliot.
Thank you very much, Yasmil, Christian, and Gregory, for joining me for this panel and this very rich discussions we had. Thank you, Jana and Andrea and the Haus der Kunst for hosting us, and bye-bye.
We see you soon.
Yeah, see you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
See you all. Yeah. Bye-bye.